Good evening to everybody out in Perth Drummers Land. Great to have you with me again. Damien here. If you've been watching along, you'll know that we are now up to part 4. Just leave a note in the comments, let me know that I'm coming through okay and that you can hear me and see me on screen. So tonight I'm coming to you from my kitchen. I'm moving some things around tonight, so I'm sort of halfway in between one room to another. But a change of scenery, they say, is like a holiday. So we're going to move on to it. So last week we were pretty much tying up the first 3 lessons all in one. So we looked at quarter notes, we looked at eighth notes, we looked at 16th notes, and we looked at combining them all together. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a concept today called layering. Now, layering with drum notation is actually very, very common. But what usually happens is when I first teach students how to read, I find that they see a piece of music, let's say it's a transcription for a song, and there's some rests and there's some notes all over the place which don't seem to make sense for what I've shown them about quarter notes, eighth notes, and sixteenths so far. And there's a reason behind it, and that reason is called layering. Now, the concept of layering is that we tend to put music kind of on top of itself. This is actually quite common in drums. You don't see it so often with other instruments where it might just be sort of one-note instruments like a trumpet or a clarinet or flute. But when we're talking about multiple percussion or multiple instruments being played at once or multiple voices, sometimes it actually makes a lot of sense to split these things and to write them all as their own piece of music, which you then read all together simultaneously. So it might sound difficult, but it's actually not that hard to do. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through once again the PowerPoint, and we're going to do a little quick recap and then move on with this new concept of layering. All right, so brought to you by the legendary Neil Peart, rest in peace. Okay, so by now we should know how to use quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes because we've had 3 lessons on this so far. Now, what we need to do is to learn how to read these all in layers. Now, I've been very careful up until now to make sure that everything that I've written and everything that I've demonstrated has all been in a single layer. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that all of the notes that you see on the page in front of you, so this is the standard rock beat, it means that all of those notes are joining together, they're all pointing upwards, and they're meant to kind of all be read as one piece of music. So from what we've learned in previous weeks, you would know that this would be counted 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, again, the standard rock beat. But when you see that beat in certain songs or certain transcriptions, sometimes it doesn't look like the way that you see it there now. And so what we need to do is we need to look at this thing now and be able to recognize it using different kinds of layers. So as we say here, drum transcriptions often split the parts of kit into layers of music, which we read simultaneously. And there are 3 common ways that it's done, but let me just show you what happens if you get to a complicated song where the song is not split into layers. So this, I don't even know what you'd call it. It's a mess. Short and simple, it's a mess. So you've got some of the stems facing up, some of the stems facing down. And as we discussed in previous weeks, that's fine. It's all allowed. But it looks really, really messy. Okay, so we need to clean this up. And one of the ways we do that is with layering. Okay, so let's have a look at our rock beat again. And in the original version, which we can see up in the top left-hand corner there, we can see that everything is split. Everything is combined into the one layer. But this larger beat that we're looking at now in front of us, this is the exact same beat represented slightly differently. And this is where we see these layers. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. First of all, we have the top line. Now, what I've decided to do in this case is I'm going to say, well, I'm going to make the hi-hats or any cymbal, anything that is cymbals, I'm going to put them all as one piece of music. Okay? So forget what's happening on the kick drum and the snare drum there. Let's just look at the hi-hats. Now, we already know that if this was its own piece of music, that those hi-hats would be counted as eighth notes. That is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, if you remember back to our Lego example, you would know that we basically filled our measure or filled our grey piece of Lego, and that measure is now closed. We can't do anything more with it. So the concept of the layering now comes in when we start putting other pieces of music underneath the hi-hats. So again, what I've done in this example is kept the hi-hats as their own piece of music, which have to add to 4 and have to fill the measure. But I've also, as a separate thing, put another layer in there. And this other layer is going to contain bass drums, snare drums, and any other drum that we play. So cymbals as one piece of music or one layer, and we're going to look at anything else on the kit as another layer. Now, have a look at this one. So here we have, these are quarter notes, as you would know. So we count them 1, 2, 3, 4. So where is this confusing for people that don't understand this? Well, what they would do is they would look at this piece of music and they'd see a quarter note on 1 and they'd say, oh, well, we know that if we have a quarter note on 1, we can't have anything else now until 2 because all of that room is taken up. So how do we have a hi-hat on one end? Okay, so that's kind of the challenge or the misunderstanding that people have. It makes sense when you look at this piece of music in layers. Okay. Now, how you decide to break up your layers is completely up to you. But the bottom line is that for every layer that you have, each layer must be full. So if there are certain notes in that layer that in that bar that are not being played on certain layers, well, then you have to start using your rests or whatever you need to fill up that measure. You can't leave it unfilled. Okay, and if you're not sure what I'm referring to there, you can go straight back to lesson 1 in the series where we talk about filling measures and how you always have to have a full 4 counts in your measures. Okay, so we've looked at the original version, which was just a single layer, and we've now looked at an alternate version which split the symbols and sort of classified them on one layer, which were counted 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then we had the bass drum and snare, which were their own layer of music, which 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? But there's another way that we can write this. Okay? Again, we're just splitting the layers differently this time. So this time, what if I said, okay, I'm going to split the layers so that I'm going to write everything that I play on my hands is going to be one layer, and everything that I play on my feet is going to be another layer. What would that look like? Well, let's have a look. So we have... let's have a look here. Here we go. Our first layer. So I've joined anything that's happening on my hands is all being joined together. So snare drums and cymbals now are going to be part of the same layer. So we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, where 2 and 4 also include a snare drum. Okay. And then as my second layer, now this is a little bit different, and let's have a look. We've got 1. There's nothing happening. There's no bass drums. There's no hi-hat foots. Nothing happening on our feet on 2. So we put in a rest. Okay? Again, people that don't understand this concept might look at the snare and hi-hat and they would say, why is there a rest there? I'm clearly playing a snare drum and a hi-hat. Yes, but it's part of a different musical layer. Okay? We get to 3. 3 is a bass drum. And then 4, of course, is a rest. So this unusual looking beat, which has rests directly underneath snares and hi-hats, hopefully now makes a little bit more sense to you. All right, so moving on. So we've got 3 different versions of writing the exact same beat. Now, in reality, we have to get used to looking at all of these and recognizing all of these. But the question now, can be said that, if I've got these 3 different methods of writing, where first of all I'm writing everything as one piece, then I'm writing everything as hands separated with feet, and then I'm writing everything with cymbals separated with drums. The question is, well, which one do I use? Which is the right one? Okay, and if you think you know, then send through a comment and I'll let you know if you're right. The answer actually is that it depends, but the question is, what does it depend on? What does it depend on? Like, what determines which one of these different layering concepts we use? Let me know in the comments. All right, so to make this a little bit easier, what I've now done is I've broken a couple of different beats up into different colors to represent different layers. Okay, so, and this beat is the same in each case. It's just a more complicated example. And so you can see, again, in the first example, everything is combined. So we've got the snares, the hi-hats, the kick drums, all combined into one piece of music. All the stems face upwards. Everything that can join does join with the flags. And this is what we have. So if we were reading this, it would be 1. 1 is an 8th note, so we know that we can have something on and. So that's and 2 and 3 and. Then we get to the last part. Now 4 has 2 flags coming off it, and we learnt last week that that represents a 16th note. So that would be 4E and up. So the rhythm there would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4E and up. Okay? Looking at the second example where we start separating hands and feet. Now this starts to get a little bit more complicated. Let's look at the red layer first, and this is where we're joining the hands. So everything on hands, cymbals, snares, all together. So we've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a. Okay, This bass drum was combined in the first example, but it's separated out now and it's part of its own piece of music. So if we have a look at the blue layer now, this is all to do with our feet. We have 1. Now, because we have a quarter note on 1, that means that the next possible opportunity we're going to have to place a note is going to be on 2. But there's actually nothing happening on 2. But we need to have a bass drum on 2, and so the count of 2 needs to be an 8th note rest. Okay? So 1, 2, and 3, and 4, E. Right? So it's a little unusual in terms of the count, but again, just use your knowledge of quarter notes, 8th notes, and 16ths, and of course the rests for those kinds of notes, to fill in the space so that you can place notes where you need them, add rests where you don't need them, and still end up having a fully closed measure at the end of that layer. So we've got 1, 2 is a rest, and 3, and 4, E, and. So that layer is actually a complete measure. It's just that there's a lot of rests in there. Now, in the third example, what we're doing is we are keeping the cymbals on their own, and we're joining anything that's a drum. Okay, so in the third example, our hi-hats in the red are going to be 1 and 2 and 3 and nothing on 4, but that is an 8th note, which means after 4, the next count would have to be and. So we've got and are. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and are. Okay, and on the blue layer, we have 1, 2, and 3, and 4, E, and. Okay, so again, both of those layers are completely full measures, sort of simulated one on top of the other. So we've just looked at this more complex beat in 3 different ways, and I ask you again, which would be the one that you would use? Okay, let's look at another example. So this time we're going to look at a drum fill, representing a drum fill using layers. Okay, so the first one, everything's combined. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 E and A. Okay, basic snare roll at the end of a measure. With our hands and feet separated, on the red layer we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 E and A. And on the foot layer we have 1, 2, 3 and 4. So quite simple actually for the feet. So hopefully this is making sense. And of course the third versions, 1 and 2 and 3 and nothing on 4. That's for the hi-hats. And then for all the drums, 1, 2, 3 and 4 E and A. Okay. Now, hopefully that makes sense. Again, this is probably not going to be a long stream today, because that's really the concept that I need you to understand. And now we're going to look at it in a real-life example. So this is Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin. Most people would know this song. It's a cracking tune. And you can see that this layering principle still applies. And what they've chosen to do in this particular example is leave the cymbals on their own layer and put all the snares and kicks onto their own layer. Okay? So there's the 2 layers, one that encapsulates the cymbals, and of course one that encapsulates all the snare and the kick drum. All right, so again, if we were going to look at these 2 layers and count them out, what we would see is that on the top line, which is just the hi-hats, we've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and pretty simple. And this is actually a good layering principle to use, because it makes it very clear that no matter what's happening underneath the hi-hats are keeping a nice steady pulse going. Okay, those little triangular shapes that you can see above these notes, that's actually an accent. So those are notes that you would hit harder on the hi-hat. Okay, our second layer, which is the remainder of the notes that are going on there, or the remainder of the voices on our kits, we have 1 and A. Okay, so 1 is an 8th note, which means our next note would have to be an and. Now, we discussed this at length last week, but if you look at the note that sits on and, we have 1 flag moving back towards the left, and we have 2 flags moving to the right, and we always take the larger one. So if it's got 2 flags coming off the stem, then that's what we're going to know the note as, and that's a 16th note. So because this note sits on and, if we're talking about counting 16th notes, 1 E and, we know the next note's going to have to be an A. So if we look at A is also a kick drum, and as you can see off the stem moving to the left, we also have 2 flags. And that means, of course, that this is also a 16th note. So 1 and A is the first part, all on the bass drums. Moving on to the count of 2 now. 2, now this is an interesting one, and again, we looked at this briefly last week. When you look at the stem on 2, we do see two flags coming off it, but only one of those flags actually joins to the stem of the next note. What's that all about? Well, again, if we can see two flags coming off the stem, then that's what the note is going to be known as. So the count of 2, which is this snare drum we're seeing here, is in fact a 16th note. So if we have a 16th note on 2, the count would be 2E and A. So 2E would be our next note. So let's have a look at E now. E is a kick drum. Now if we look at the stem and the flags coming off the stem, it doesn't matter which direction we choose to look at for the flag, there's only one line coming off that stem in either direction. And this is why the second flag on the previous note does not touch this note on E. Because what we're trying to say here is that this note on E is an 8th note. Okay, we know that 8th notes only have one flag coming off them, and so it's an 8th note. Now, you might say to yourself, well, yeah, that's well and good, Damo, but an 8th note doesn't occur on E. An 8th note is always 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And if you were listening really carefully in the earlier exercises, you'll know that this is when we start talking about the concept of syncopation, where we don't just put 8th notes on 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and we can actually put them anywhere, but they must take up 1/8 note worth of room. And we know that that is actually, in fact, 2 16th notes worth of room, or half a quarter notes worth of room. You can think about it however you'd like. But what this would mean is, if I had an 8th note on the count of 2E, it would mean that that note would have to take up not only 2E, but also 2 and. It must occupy 2 16th notes worth of room. After that point, you can then have your next note. So what happens here in this little block that we're looking at is we have 2 on the snare, E on the kick drum, nothing on and because it's still part of this 8th note that we played on the bass drum, and then the next available note is and, which once again you can see is a snare drum, and once again you can see we have 2 flags coming to the left of that note, so that's a 16th note. And if that note is a 16th note, what comes after 2E, in fact that's an error there, that should be A, not and. So what comes after 2 A? Well, it's going to be 3. So we look at 3, and on the count of 3 we have 3 as an 8th note, and then you've got and A. So that's 3 and A, 3 and A. Okay, and then moving on to the block in 4, we have 4. It's much like we saw on the count of 2. So it's 2, E, nothing, and then A. Again, apologies, that's an error. That should not be and, it should be A. So 2, E, and A. All right. In fact, I'll just take a moment right now. Why not? And I'll just correct that so that we're all on the same page with this one. Bear with me a second. Just write me a comment. Let me know that you're all out there. Okay, so back to our slide. And this is how it should appear. Okay, so those counts are actually the and would be in the middle here, where the 8th note is now actually covering over that, so we don't have any room to put a note there because of this 8th note and vice versa. So you see there that we have 2 completely different counts going on in the same measure. We've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and for the top layer, but the bottom layer is 1 and 2 E, 3 and 4 E. Okay, but it doesn't matter. If you look really closely, you can see that in both layers, the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 all line up vertically. So what you're expected to do as a drummer when you see rhythms like this is to try and put it all together and play it as one piece of music, but knowing full well that it has to be written as if it is 2 separate pieces of music broken into these layers that we've been talking about. So again, why would we do this? Well, the reason we do this is because if you can break notes into layers, often it can actually make things easier to read. Okay, and this is a good example. If you have a look at this as a rhythm, now even if you've never heard this song before, you can see that there's quite a lot going on the kick drum and snare drums, but the hi-hats are pretty steady. They're just counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, if I was to join all of that together in one layer, there would be a whole bunch of 16ths and 8ths and all sorts of stuff all combined together, and it becomes difficult to read, right? By doing it this way, where the cymbals are separated from the kick drum and snare, we not only see that the cymbal pattern is simple, right, because it's separated into its own part, but we can also see that there's a melody going on between the kick and snare, boom, 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 ba boom, ba boom, 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 ba boom, ba boom, 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 ba boom. Okay, and that helps us to move through the music and read the music more cleanly. Now, separating things by cymbals versus drums may not be the best way. So we did have that question before. Which one do you use? Do you put it all in one piece of music? Do you separate the cymbals from the kicks and snares? Or do you separate your hands from your feet? And the answer to the question is, it doesn't matter. You would separate it depending on what is the easiest to read and what makes the most sense from how you would approach playing that rhythm. Okay? In this example, Immigrant Song, I think that is probably the nicest way to do it because it's very clear what the kick and snare are doing, and it's very clear what the hi-hat is doing. If I was to break that so that the snares were joining upwards into the hi-hats, it would make the bass drum component look kind of nasty. You'd have little 16th note rests here and there, and it just wouldn't be nice to read. By doing it this way, we can see that we don't have any rests in that measure at all. So, look, hopefully that makes sense. Again, a little bit shorter tonight, but you need to understand that concept of layering because if you don't, then it's going to throw you off when we move on to the next section. Now, I did promise that I was going to get into time signatures tonight, but there's actually a couple of things that I realized I haven't covered, and I want to cover those before we do anything. And those are going to be dotted notes first. Hey, Damien, how you doing? Those are dotted notes, and then I want to get onto time signatures because I think by that time we pretty much understand everything we need to. Now, time signatures, the reason I'm talking up time signatures is because when you can learn to count, as we've been learning over the last couple of weeks, once you learn how to count, you can technically read and play any time signature. And it's kind of funny, really, because time signatures confuse a lot of people and they think that there's some big mystery and some big scientific thing behind it, and there isn't. You just have to understand what different kinds of notes are and how to count them. Now, we've learnt that over the last few weeks, so by the time we get into this time signature concept, it should be very, very easy for you. Not only easy to play a certain time signature, but it actually becomes very easy to hear and to transcribe certain time signatures. So if you've ever sat down, you've tried to listen to a Dream Theater song, or or a Porcupine Tree song, or something that's an odd time signature, or maybe something from Tool, or what have you. If you're really struggling to figure out how the beat is supposed to be played or where the pulse is, it helps to know the time signature. And by the time we get onto that, you're going to have the tools to be able to hear that, to figure out what the time signature is, and then it'll be almost like a curtain lifts, and it's like, oh, wow, this is actually really easy stuff. All right, so I'll just wait around for 10 or 15 seconds, and if anybody has some questions, feel free to ask away. I shall just have a drink. Okay, well, I'll leave it there. And as I said, next week we'll look into dotted notation. Dotted notation is a little bit tricky when you first hear of the concept. But again, as I've stressed every week, go back over the lessons that we've covered, because if you understand everything that we've covered thus far, it shouldn't be too difficult to pick up. So have a great night. And as usual, feel free to message me either on chat or any way that you know how. And I can answer your questions offline. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great evening.